A woman slept quietly in economy class, until the captain's terrified voice echoed, "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" What happened next left 312 passengers stunned, and changed history forever. The Boeing 747 sliced through the cold Atlantic night, its massive wings trembling under a sky swollen with black clouds. At first it was only a whisper of turbulence, the kind that makes coffee ripple in plastic cups and passengers glance uneasily at the seatbelt sign. Flight attendants moved down the aisle with rehearsed smiles, steadying themselves with one hand on the seats, their voices calm, almost rehearsed, assuring everyone that this was nothing unusual. A little bump, a patch of weather, nothing more. But outside the windows, lightning was beginning to flash in ragged streaks, illuminating walls of cloud that seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. The reassurance faded when the plane suddenly dropped, a stomach-wrenching plunge that sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled, a child cried out, and the polished calm of the flight crew cracked for the first time. Somewhere near the front of the aircraft, a muffled thud echoed. Captain Mitchell, a veteran with decades of service, had slumped forward in his seat, his body rigid, hands convulsing on the controls. His co-pilot, James Wilson, barely 30, felt the color drain from his face. He tugged at the yoke, tried to steady the massive jet, but the storm had already wrapped them in its fists. Monitors blared red warnings. Altitude fluctuated. The captain was unresponsive, his breath shallow, his eyes rolled back. James reached for the intercom, his hand trembling so badly that he pressed the wrong button twice before finding his voice. It came out hoarse, cracking under the weight of fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your first officer. We have a serious emergency. Captain Mitchell is unconscious. I repeat, the captain is incapacitated. I need immediate assistance. If anyone on board has military aviation training," his voice faltered, caught on the terror that gripped his chest. "Please, if there is any fighter pilot on board, I need you now." The words bled through the cabin like cold water on bare skin. For a moment there was only stunned silence, disbelief, the kind of silence where hundreds of people strain to understand if they heard right. Then panic cracked open. A woman gasped, clutching her rosary beads. A man muttered prayers under his breath. Somewhere in the back, a teenager pulled out his phone and typed frantically, his eyes glistening. The air was thick with the sound of children crying, the metallic clatter of dropped cups, the hushed voices of those whispering final messages to loved ones. The Boeing shook again, harder, as if the storm wanted to remind them who was in control. James gripped the yoke with white knuckles, sweat pouring down his temple. He had trained for turbulence, for engine failures, for medical diversions. But never this. Never blind flight into a Category 5 storm with 312 souls depending on him alone. His voice returned, breaking, desperate, piped through every speaker on the plane. "Please, is there anyone here who has flown in combat? Anyone with fighter jet experience? I cannot do this alone." Outside the windows, lightning tore across the sky in violent arcs. Inside, terror spread seat to seat like a contagion. Passengers who minutes ago were half smiling at turbulence now clutched armrests as if they could anchor the plane by sheer force of will. Others hunched over their phones, typing last words, the glow of the screens catching the sheen of tears. The storm roared louder, engines howling, metal groaning under the strain. At 38,000 feet, it felt like the world was ending. And yet, in row 23C, a woman stirred, slowly lifting her head from the window where she had been sleeping soundly, as if the chaos around her belonged to another universe. She blinked once, twice, her face calm, unreadable. For now she said nothing. But the call had been made. A fighter pilot was needed. And the most underestimated passenger on that plane was about to change everything. In the dim cabin light, panic had not yet hardened into full chaos, but it trembled there, waiting. Whispers darted between rows, quick and nervous, as if saying them aloud too clearly might make the danger real. Passengers craned their necks toward the cockpit door, toward the intercom, toward each other, searching for someone who could possibly answer the call that had just shattered the air. A man in business casual muttered to his wife, who would be in economy class and also be a fighter pilot, "That's impossible." A woman across the aisle shook her head, whispering back, "If such a person existed, they would be in first class, not back here with the rest of us." The subtext was clear and ugly. Ordinary seats belong to ordinary people. In row 23C, Kesha Washington shifted in her seat. Her jeans were worn but neat, her blouse plain, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She stretched her shoulders as though waking from a dream, her gaze steady as she took in the fear that filled the plane like smoke. She said nothing. Not yet. Up in first class, where the leather seats gleamed and champagne glasses had been half full only minutes ago, a man stood abruptly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver cufflinks that caught the cabin lights as he adjusted his suit jacket. Richard Blackwood. A name that often appeared in financial magazines, attached to headlines about investments and wealth. His voice boomed across the cabin with the confidence of someone used to being listened to. "Ladies and gentlemen, I can help." His tone left little room for doubt. "My brother-in-law is a private pilot. I have flown with him dozens of times. I know the procedures." He waved a dismissive hand toward the economy rows, as if eliminating competition that did not exist. "This aircraft needs someone who understands aviation, someone who has experience. I have that experience." The nearest flight attendant, already pale with fear, turned to him with desperate hope. "Sir, we need someone with military aviation training. Commercial or civilian flights are not the same." Richard's jaw tightened, his voice rising. "Are you doubting me? I have logged more hours in the skies than anyone else on this plane. I paid $15,000 for these seats. Do you think I would sit here if I didn't know how to handle myself at 38,000 feet? His arrogance dripped into the silence that followed, filling the void like oil on water. Around him, some passengers nodded, eager for anyone to take charge, eager to believe that money and confidence could equal competence. Others glanced uneasily at the flight attendants, searching their faces for signs of reassurance. None came. Kesha inhaled slowly, her heartbeat steady even as the storm hammered harder against the fuselage. She rose from her seat, her movements unhurried, almost fluid, the opposite of the frantic gestures around her. The crowd parted reluctantly as she stepped into the aisle. She stood not with bluster but with the quiet authority of someone who had carried responsibility in moments when hesitation meant death. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm, clear, not raised but carrying all the same. "Colonel Kesha Washington, United States Air Force. 500 hours flight time in F-22 Raptors. Specialized in navigation under extreme conditions." For a heartbeat, the cabin froze. Even the storm outside seemed to hesitate. All eyes locked on her. The murmurs died. The businessman in the next row blinked, as though seeing her for the first time. The woman who had whispered about economy class covered her mouth with her hand. The silence stretched until Richard broke it with a laugh, sharp and bitter. "You have got to be kidding me." His voice dripped with disbelief, each word a dagger meant to cut her down. "Look at her. Jeans, a blouse, sitting in the cheap seats. A fighter pilot. I wouldn't trust her to park a car, let alone fly this plane." He turned to the passengers near him, fishing for agreement. "This is a fantasy. And you want to bet your lives on a fantasy?" The flight attendant nearest Kesha took an involuntary step back, caught between two worlds, between the commanding calm in Kesha's eyes and the moneyed certainty in Richard's. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, torn between prejudice and hope, between appearances and survival. Kesha's gaze did not waver. She had seen this look before, the disbelief, the laughter, the easy dismissal. She let it wash over her like rain on steel. For years she had endured it. For years she had turned it into fuel. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The twist was already alive in the cabin air. The person most dismissed, most underestimated, most invisible was suddenly the only one who might stand between 312 souls and the storm that clawed at their wings. The cockpit door opened with a groan of hinges, and the storm's rage seemed to surge inside with her. Red warning lights pulsed across the panels like frantic heartbeats, screens flickering as if unsure whether to hold on or shut down entirely. Rain hammered the windshield so hard it looked like the ocean itself had risen to swallow them. James Wilson sat stiff in the captain's chair, his hands shaking on the controls, sweat soaking through his crisp uniform. His eyes darted not to Kesha but back toward the cabin, toward Richard Blackwood's looming figure, as if waiting for permission from wealth rather than wisdom. Kesha's voice cut through the static. Altitude, airspeed, crosswinds, report them now. James hesitated, his mouth dry, his gaze flicking once more to Richard, who smirked as though daring him to resist. The plane lurched sideways, oxygen masks swinging above like pendulums of doom. Kesha repeated herself, her voice colder, sharper, the tone of someone who had commanded squadrons through hell. Report, Lieutenant. The word cracked the air like a whip, leaving no space for disobedience. James stammered, 38,000 feet, 450 knots, crosswinds 120, gusts 160. His voice trembled, but the numbers spilled out. The authority in her tone had snapped him free from paralysis. Kesha's hands moved over the panels, not frantically but with precise economy, as if each motion had been practiced 1,000 times. She began reciting, clear and unwavering, emergency procedure for loss of pressurization at cruising altitude. Immediate oxygen deployment. Controlled descent to 10,000 feet. Angle not exceeding 15 degrees to prevent structural failure. Code 770 to air traffic control. Her words poured like scripture, memorized not from manuals but from survival, from nights when the difference between life and death was knowing without hesitation. The intercom carried her voice into the cabin, and for the first time since the crisis began, silence spread among the passengers. Even children stopped crying, their wide eyes fixed on the woman whose calmness seemed almost unnatural against the chaos rattling the aircraft apart. But Richard broke the silence with a laugh that grated against the fragile hope in the room. Anyone can memorize a manual, he sneered, leaning against the doorway as though he owned it. That doesn't make her a pilot. She's playing soldier while our lives hang by a thread. His words dripped with poison, each syllable meant to chip away at the fragile trust beginning to form. Kesha's face remained unreadable, but inside a familiar burn ignited. She had heard these words before. In briefing rooms where white officers raised eyebrows at her name. On flight lines where her orders were questioned twice as often as anyone else's. In promotion boards where whispers about quotas circled like vultures. She had carried them through every mission, every impossible flight, turning their doubt into fuel, their contempt into fire. She looked at James, who was staring at her now not with dismissal but with the stunned recognition of a man who knew authority when he heard it. Mr. Wilson, she said, her voice calm again, steady as bedrock, you will monitor fuel and pressurization every 30 seconds. You will not deviate. Do you understand? For a breath, he hesitated, caught between the mocking weight of Richard's scorn and the sharp gravity of her command. Then something shifted in his eyes. His shoulders straightened, his jaw set. Yes, ma'am, he said, the words firm, clear, a soldier's acknowledgement. Outside, the storm still clawed at the jet with merciless fury. But inside, a new silence formed. It was not the silence of fear, not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of recognition, the moment when an audience realizes they are not watching an imposter, but a leader. For the first time, James Wilson believed he might live through the night, because a woman he had never noticed before had stepped into the cockpit and reminded him what real command sounded like. The storm had grown into a living thing, a monster that clawed at the Boeing with fists of wind and sheets of rain. Lightning cracked against the clouds so close that the entire cockpit flashed white, shadows leaping across Kesha's face as her hands danced over the trembling controls. The radar screen stuttered, then blinked into darkness, leaving only static and a red warning that screamed blind flight. Behind her, Captain Mitchell convulsed violently, foam at his lips, his body jerking against the harness as if he too were being battered by the storm. His monitors shrieked alarms, each one adding to the deafening chaos. Kesha's eyes flicked between the failing instruments and the man beside her. One hand steady on the yoke, she reached with the other to check his pulse, her movements precise, practiced, as though she had been here before, not in this cockpit, but in tents lit by lanterns, in deserts where every second meant another soldier's life. "First aid now," she commanded, her voice slicing through the noise. "James, monitor the instruments. If the captain's pulse drops below 60, alert me immediately." Her tone left no room for hesitation, and James, still shaking, obeyed. Outside the cockpit, panic spilled into the cabin like a contagion. The violent drops and shudders had passengers gripping their armrests until knuckles went white. In first class, Richard Blackwood rose to his feet again, his voice cutting through the chaos with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Do you all see what's happening?" he shouted, his face flushed with righteous anger. "This woman is pretending. She's improvising while the captain dies beside her. We are trusting our lives to a fraud." He scanned the faces around him, searching for allies, and fear made them easy prey. A middle-aged man nodded nervously, clutching his wife's hand. A young mother whispered that she didn't want her children's fate decided by someone in jeans. Richard pressed on, emboldened. "I have flown in more private jets than she has ever seen. I know the procedures. We are letting ourselves be led by someone who does not belong in this cockpit." Cabin voices rose in a low chorus of doubt, some hesitant, some furious, feeding off Richard's bravado. Fear divided them like cracks spreading across glass. But inside the cockpit, Kesha ignored his words. She tightened Mitchell's oxygen mask, tilted his head to keep his airway clear, and stabilized the yoke with a single steady hand. Her mind was a symphony of calculations, altitude, wind shear, descent options, all while her heart measured the fragile rhythm of a man's life. The door burst open then, and a new voice entered the storm. Calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had stood in the middle of chaos many times before. "Colonel Washington, I'm Dr. Patricia Chun, Neurosurgery Chief, Johns Hopkins. I spent 3 years in military hospitals treating pilots with neurological trauma. I can help stabilize the captain." The words landed like an anchor in the rushing tide of fear. For the first time, another authority figure had stepped forward, not to question Kesha, but to stand beside her. Kesha turned briefly, their eyes locking, two professionals recognizing each other not by name but by the steel forged in crisis. "Doctor, your assistance is welcome." "Monitor his vitals," she replied without missing a beat, returning instantly to the controls. The cabin had gone strangely quiet as Dr. Chun slipped past Richard, her presence undeniable. Richard's face twisted, his voice rising higher, desperate now. "This is madness. You're all letting her gamble with our lives." "But Dr. Chun faced him with the patience of someone used to relatives screaming in hospital corridors. "Mr. Blackwood," she said firmly, "I have treated hundreds of pilots, soldiers, men who lived or died depending on who sat in the cockpit. I can tell you without hesitation, this woman has training no amount of money can buy." The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Some passengers lowered their eyes, ashamed of the whispers they had spoken moments before. Others straightened, their doubt beginning to falter. Fear still gnawed at them, but now something else flickered underneath it, faint but undeniable. Trust. The plane shuddered again, a violent drop that drew screams from every section, coffee and tears spilling alike. Yet above the cries, above Richard's desperate protests, there was a new silence too. A silence of choice. The cabin was no longer united by panic. It was divided now, a fracture line splitting between those still clinging to prejudice and those slowly, reluctantly, beginning to believe in the calm voice of a black woman no one had noticed before she stood. In the storm's roar, that fracture was the first glimpse of something unexpected, something Richard had not prepared for. The beginning of faith. The cockpit pulsed with red alarms and the low groan of straining engines, but inside the chaos Kesha's face remained carved in stone. James sat beside her, breathing fast, his hands twitching over the controls like a man trying to remember which way was up. Behind them Dr. Chun bent over Captain Mitchell, her calm hands moving with surgical precision as the storm tried to tear the plane from the sky. For a moment it felt as if every soul on board was holding their breath, waiting for something more than hope, waiting for certainty. Kesha reached for the radio, her voice steady, stripped of doubt. Andrews Air Force Base, this is Colonel Washington, call sign Spectre, requesting identity confirmation for civil emergency. The name left her lips like a secret unlocked, a key turning in a lock no one else even knew existed. The response crackled through the speakers almost instantly, urgent, shaken. Spectre? Is that really you? We lost you on radar 20 minutes ago. The entire Air Force is mobilized looking for you. For a beat, even the storm seemed to pause. James's head whipped toward her, eyes wide. Dr. Chun froze, her stethoscope against the captain's chest. And outside the cockpit door, the stunned silence of 300 passengers thickened until it pressed against the air like another wall of weather. In first class, Richard Blackwood's smirk dissolved into something pale, brittle, his lips parting but no sound coming out. The name Spectre had cut through his arrogance like lightning through the clouds. He knew it. They all knew it. It was not the name of an amateur or a fraud. It was the name whispered in articles, mentioned in documentaries, the pilot who had done the impossible more times than anyone had believed possible. Spectre. Andrews Base again, now with more voices layered over the channel. Colonel Washington, we confirm your identity. The President has been briefed. You have top priority. General Hayes of Air Operations speaking. All East Coast airspace has been cleared for you. Every civilian and military runway is at your disposal. You are authorized to do whatever is necessary. James's hands shook, but this time not from fear. It was awe. His eyes found her, and for the first time since the storm began they were steady. In the cabin the whispers started soft, hesitant, then built like a tide. Spectre. That Spectre. She's the one who guided a C-130 through a sandstorm. She's the one they call a living legend. The shock rolled from row to row until even children hushed, sensing they were in the presence of something extraordinary. Richard tried to speak, his voice a hoarse rasp. This can't be real. But no one was listening. Faces that had moments ago mirrored his skepticism now turned away, ashamed, reverent, clinging to the revelation that the woman they had dismissed was not just qualified. She was history in motion. In the cockpit Kesha's hands never faltered, her voice calm as she acknowledged command. Roger, General. Situation is medical emergency and weather anomaly. Requesting coordinates for emergency landing, heavy aircraft capacity. Dover Air Force Base runway cleared, General Hayes replied without hesitation. Foam deployment active. Ambulances in position. You have absolute priority, Spectre. James exhaled shakily, almost laughing from disbelief. Ma'am, the entire eastern seaboard just cleared its skies for you. Kesha allowed herself a single glance at him, a flicker of a smile that carried no pride, only certainty. Focus, Lieutenant. We're not done yet. Behind the cockpit door, passengers shifted in their seats, their fear bending into something new. Faith. They had doubted her, ridiculed her, dismissed her as ordinary. Now they whispered her call sign like a prayer. Spectre. The storm still raged outside, but inside the aircraft a greater storm had broken, the shattering of prejudice, replaced with the uneasy, humbling realization that they had been wrong about everything. The storm outside had grown into an apocalypse. Lightning carved jagged scars across the black sky, thunder detonated so close it rattled every bolt in the fuselage, and the Boeing 747 shuddered like a wounded animal trapped in the claws of something far bigger than itself. Sheets of rain slammed against the cockpit windows, making the world outside look like an endless wall of water. James Wilson stared at the instruments, wide-eyed, his lips moving soundlessly as numbers dipped and spiked like a heart about to flatline. Dar. Chun gripped the side rail, bracing herself while keeping Captain Mitchell stable, her calm professionalism strained by the violent lurch of the aircraft. In the cabin, passengers screamed, prayed, clung to strangers. The illusion of safety was gone. They were no longer travelers between destinations. They were souls suspended over the ocean, at the mercy of a storm that seemed intent on swallowing them whole. Kesha Washington's hands held the yoke like a sculptor shaping steel. Her voice, calm but commanding, cut through the madness. James, listen carefully. We are not going around this storm. We are going through it. James whipped his head toward her as if she had lost her mind. Ma'am, that's impossible. Boeing 747s don't have the maneuverability. Safety protocols. Kesha silenced him with a glance that carried the weight of 17 years of impossible missions. Rules keep you alive in clear skies, she said evenly. Experience keeps you alive in storms. For a moment, James could only stare, caught between fear and awe. Then the aircraft pitched hard to the left as Kesha guided it toward the boiling wall of cloud ahead. The cabin erupted in screams as the horizon vanished and the plane tilted at an angle no commercial jet had ever been meant to endure. Oxygen masks swung wildly, luggage burst free from overhead bins, crashing down on terrified passengers. A child was ripped from her mother's grasp and only saved when a stranger lunged across the aisle to catch her. Gravity itself seemed to fracture, throwing bodies against seatbelts and scattering belongings like debris in a hurricane. In first class, Richard Blackwood clung to the armrests, his expensive watch catching the light of a lightning flash as his face twisted with naked fear. He tried to shout, to demand, but his voice broke into a shrill cry swallowed by the storm and the panic around him. Then the plane dropped. It was sudden, savage, like falling off the edge of the world. Passengers screamed in unison, a sound so raw it pierced the roar of the engines. Drinks, phones, even shoes floated for a split second before slamming back down as the aircraft plummeted thousands of feet. Alarms shrieked in the cockpit. James's hands flailed over the controls, desperate to regain stability, but Kesha's grip never faltered. Her eyes scanned the instruments with laser precision, her body braced as though fused with the machine itself. Not yet, she whispered, almost to herself. Hold it. The plane pitched violently again, wings slicing through turbulence so brutal it threatened to tear the craft apart. Metal groaned, rivets strained, the entire frame protesting against forces it had never been designed to endure. Passengers were thrown from their seats, bodies colliding in aisles, cries mixing with prayers. A flight attendant slammed against the galley door, dazed but alive, scrambling back to help others. It was chaos, a portrait of despair painted in lightning and fear. And through it all, Kesha sat steady, shoulders squared, hands unyielding on the controls. She pulled the aircraft into a dive, deeper, faster, straight into the heart of the storm. James gasped, "Ma'am, this descent is suicidal, we'll break apart." Kesha's voice was steel. "Trust me." Then came the moment. The near failure. The aircraft rolled too far, the wing dipping until it seemed certain the entire plane would flip, sending 312 souls spinning into the ocean below. Gasps turned into shrieks, people thrown against windows, loose objects flying like shrapnel. James gripped the dash, his knuckles bone-white. Dr. Chun clung to Captain Mitchell's seat, her jaw set, refusing to flinch. And then, Richard Blackwood's voice rose, not in arrogance but in surrender. "Please," he cried, his voice cracking, his face pale with terror. "Please, I was wrong. Save us." The words hung in the air, a confession from a man who had never begged for anything, now stripped to his most fragile truth. Kesha didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her answer was not words but action. She forced the yoke forward, muscles straining as though she were wrestling the storm itself. The Boeing responded, groaning but obeying, the nose angling into a narrow corridor of calmer air, an invisible tunnel carved by her instinct, her memory, her experience. The storm howled around them, walls of cloud lit by violent flashes of lightning, but within that column the aircraft stabilized. It was still rough, still dangerous, but survivable. The cabin that had been a cauldron of chaos began to settle, screams fading into sobs, sobs fading into stunned silence. James looked at her as though seeing something not quite human. "Ma'am, how did you even know that air current existed?" 10 years flying through sandstorms and hurricanes, she answered without a flicker of hesitation. When you survive the impossible enough times, the extraordinary becomes routine. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm's fading fury outside and the ragged breathing of hundreds of passengers realizing they were still alive. The aircraft continued its controlled descent, slipping below the worst of the turbulence, engines straining but holding. In the cabin, heads turned, eyes wide, tears streaming. The woman they had doubted, mocked, dismissed had just dragged them back from the edge of death with a maneuver no manual had ever dared to describe. Richard sat slumped in his seat, his arrogance shattered, his plea still echoing in his ears. For the first time in his life, he understood that money and privilege could not buy survival. It was competence, and competence alone, that had saved him. The storm still rumbled outside, a reminder of the abyss they had crossed, but inside the Boeing a new silence had taken root. It was not the silence of fear, but of awe. 312 people had just witnessed the impossible, and they knew it. Kesha Washington had done more than fly them through a storm. She had flown them through their own prejudice, their own blindness, and brought them out the other side alive. And in that silence, reverence began to bloom. Dover Air Force Base shimmered in the floodlights, foam spread across the runway, ambulances lined up like sentinels. The Boeing 747 descended in a controlled glide, its battered frame carrying the weight of 312 prayers. Inside, the cabin was silent, the kind of silence that comes not from calm but from exhaustion, from hearts stretched to their breaking point. Then the wheels kissed the tarmac. A jolt, a screech of tires, and the impossible was done. The aircraft slowed, steadied, came to rest. For a heartbeat there was nothing, just disbelief. Then sobs erupted, followed by applause, raw and thunderous, echoing against the cabin walls. Passengers clutched each other, some collapsing into tears, others laughing through cries. A little girl pressed against her mother's side whispered softly, as if confessing a secret. "She saved us." Her words spread like fire, whispered row to row until the entire cabin seemed to breathe it together. "She saved us." Kesha remained in the cockpit, her hands still on the controls, steady until the very end. Only when the engines wound down did she exhale and allow herself the smallest nod, a soldier's acknowledgement that the mission was complete. 6 months later, the storm was no longer just weather. It was history. At the Pentagon, in a ceremony broadcast across the nation, Kesha Washington stood in uniform as the Secretary of Defense placed a star on her shoulder. Brigadier General. The youngest black woman ever to hold the rank. Her storm navigation technique had been studied, codified, and integrated into military training manuals around the world. Universities offered courses in her name. Her book, Flying Through the Storms, topped bestseller lists, its proceeds funding scholarships for young pilots from backgrounds like hers, the ones no one expected to rise. Dr. Patricia Chun published with her a groundbreaking study on emergency aviation medicine. James Wilson, once trembling in the cockpit, now captained his own aircraft, always telling new recruits about the night Spectre showed him what leadership truly meant. But not all stories ended in triumph. Richard Blackwood's face was no longer seen in glossy magazines but on viral clips replayed with scorn. His sneering words on the plane had been recorded, spreading across social media with millions of views. Clients abandoned his investment firm, his fortune crumbled, lawsuits piled. Within 3 months he filed for bankruptcy. His wife divorced him, taking their children and half the remaining assets. His daughter, 12 years old, asked innocently why people laughed when they searched his name online, and the question cut deeper than any headline. The man who once believed money equaled competence now rode public transportation to his job at a used car dealership, forced to live the ordinary life he had always despised. It was there, years later, in an airport terminal crowded with travelers, that he saw her again. She walked through flanked by aides and security, the star on her shoulder gleaming, her presence commanding without a word spoken. For a moment Richard stood frozen, the noise of the terminal fading until all he could hear was his own shallow breath. He stepped forward hesitantly, clutching a cheap suitcase, his suit worn at the seams. "General Washington," he said softly, his voice stripped of arrogance, only humility left. I need to apologize." Kesha paused, studying him. She did not see the man who had mocked her, but someone broken by his own ignorance. "Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly, "you gave me the greatest gift possible that day." His eyes widened, confused. "How so?" "You reminded me why I do what I do. Every pilot I train, every life I save, every barrier I break, it is fueled by voices like yours. Doubt sharpens us. Prejudice challenges us. And overcoming both proves us." Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I lost everything because of my arrogance." "No," she replied gently, "you discovered you never had anything real to lose. Privilege is not achievement. Respect is not inheritance. Competence is not appearance." She moved on, her team surrounding her, the star on her shoulder glinting under the lights. Richard stood alone, realizing the truth. Her revenge had not been his ruin. Her revenge was the brilliance of a legacy so vast it rendered his cruelty meaningless. Success was not only the best revenge. It was the only revenge. And as the crowd parted for her, the whispers followed. Spectre. The legend who had once flown through the storm. The woman who had turned prejudice into history. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.